It is the 22nd of April 1176, outside the village of Tel Sultan, in the modern-day district of Iblid, Syria. As his army advances towards their Zengid adversaries in the shimmering 33-degree heat of the desert, the Sultan of Egypt watches as the air fills with the sound of charging footfall and clashing swords. Then, the Sultan's forces retreat unannounced as their left flank is forced back, and the enemy capitalizes by charging towards the center of the enormous Ayyubid army. As a response, the Ayyubid commander draws his sword, surveys his surroundings, and charges, his garments flapping in the wind, whispering at his adversaries. His name was Saladin. The Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt was born in 1137 AD in Tikrit, which is situated on the right bank of the Tigris between Mosul and Baghdad in modern-day Iraq. His historical designation is Saladin or Salah ad-Din, which translates to righteousness of the faith. Najm ad-Din Ayyub, who was the governor of Tikrit at the time and was a man of integrity, honesty, and good character, was Saladin's father. His family had strong ties to the Shaddadid dynasty, which ruled portions of Armenia from the 10th to the 12th centuries. Yusuf was Saladin's given name, and his ancestry can be traced back to the Kurdish regions of contemporary Iraq and Armenia. His father evacuated the family from Tikrit on the night of Saladin's birth because he had housed Zengid soldiers, which infuriated the regional administration. Eventually, the family settled in Damascus, the ancient capital of modern-day Syria and one of the most significant cities in the world. Saladin reportedly possessed the leadership qualities necessary for his time. His education was diverse, encompassing alchemy and arithmetic in addition to religion and the Quran. Saladin spoke Kurdish and Arabic fluently. Initially, he was more interested in studying religion than strategy and tactics, but he was eventually assigned the guidance of his uncle, Asad ad-Din Shirkuh, an esteemed scholar. Amidst the European Christian conquest of the Holy Land during the last crusade in the 11th century, several kingdoms had been established, most notably the Principality of Antioch and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. As a consequence, the Islamic world in the Middle East was confronted with an urgent need to enhance its military prowess. Thus, Saladin's acquisition of fundamental military command skills during this period would prove advantageous in the years to come. Following its inception in the 6th century, Islam experienced swift expansion across diverse caliphates, which were essentially regions of the Muslim world governed by caliphs. These caliphates were governed by religious leaders, who were either selected by Sunni Muslims or descended directly from the Prophet Muhammad in the case of Shia Muslims. Muslim rulers ruled over their respective territories while remaining loyal to their caliphs, whether Sunni or Shia. This is comparable to medieval France or England, which were independent states but swore allegiance to the papacy. In fact, in order to comprehend the balance of power in the Middle East at the time, it is essential to recall the struggle for power between Sunni and Shia caliphs, in addition to the various Muslim states or empire and the papacy. In response to the Seljuk Empire's increasing encroachment on Byzantine territories in Anatolia, the First Crusade was proclaimed. At the time of Saladin's birth, the Fatimid dynasty ruled Egypt and eastern North Africa, while the Seljuk Empire, which was largely of Turkish descent, dominated much of the Middle East. Saladin, originally of Turkish descent, spent his formative years in what is now northern Iraq. Although this region was ruled by the Zengid dynasty, it remained largely under the control of the Seljuk Empire, as Zengid Syria was a vassal of the Seljuk Empire and Emir Nur ad-Din ruled Syria at the time. However, the majority of Saladin's life and destiny would transpire in regions Egypt and the Holy Land, further south of his birthplace in modern-day Iraq. It was in these regions that he would establish a dynasty in his own name and alter the course of history throughout the Middle East and beyond. In 1163, a power struggle between Durjam and Shawwah resulted in Durjam expelling the vizier, or political ruler, of Egyptian Fatimid Caliph al-Adid, Shawwah. Shawwah then beseeched Nur ad-Din, the ruler of Syria, for assistance in regaining power. In exchange for an alliance against the Crusaders, Nur ad-Din granted his request and dispatched his general Shirkuh and the 26-year-old Saladin to intervene in Egypt. The expedition yielded favorable results, restoring Shirkuh to the position of vizier. However, Shirkuh persisted in withdrawing his forces from the area, despite the vizier offering the Syrian general 30,000 dinars in exchange for the service of his army. Following this, Nur ad-Din, the leader of Syria, capitalized on the Fatimids' vulnerability in Egypt to seize de facto control of the country, thereby effectively installing Shirkuh as ruler of Egypt and permitting the Zengid to annexation of the territory. An additional point of contention emerged due to the fact that the Fatimids in Egypt adhered to Shia Islam and desired their rulers to be selected from the direct lineage of the Prophet Muhammad, whereas the Zengids in Syria, including Saladin, were Sunni Muslims who advocated for the selection of Muhammad's successors from within the community of his disciples. Shirkuh, feeling betrayed by Shirkuh and the Syrian Sunni forces that remained in his country, petitioned Amalric I, the Christian king of Jerusalem, to intervene. As a result, Shirkuh and Amalric united and besieged Shirkuh in the city of Bilbis. However, Shirkuh and Nur ad-Din, the leader of Saladin in Syria, directed his forces against the Crusader state of Antioch. Count of Tripoli, Raymond III, was captured in the Battle of Hattin 1164. Tripoli, during that period, operated as a Crusader state but was also subordinate to Jerusalem. As a result, Amalric and his forces were compelled to hasten north in order to assist Raymond, while Shirkuh evacuated his forces north into Syria in order to safeguard their northern borders against Syria. In doing so, he assisted his master and ensured that the Fatimid dynasty and Shirkuh maintained their authority for the time being. Nevertheless, in 1166, Shirkuh and Saladin made a second attempt to retake Egypt, which prompted Shirkuh to beg King Amalric for assistance in the conflict. Amalric's naval forces held an early advantage due to their control over the eastern Mediterranean. Thus, they were able to convene in Cairo with Shirkuh and the Fatimids prior to Shirkuh and Saladin's landfall in the region. As a consequence, the Zengid Syrian forces engaged in the Battle of al-Baybine, where Saladin commanded the right wing. The encounter was characterized by intense bloodshed and a lack of resolution. Ultimately, the Syrians attempted to flee Egypt through the port of Alexandria. However, their endeavors were thwarted by Amalric's fleet. Consequently, Saladin and Shirkuh reached a ceasefire and departed Egypt, contingent upon King Amalric's reciprocal action. This circumstance was advantageous for Shirkuh and the Fatimids, as it ensured their continued rule. Additionally, it benefited Amalric, who maintained a friendly yet feeble neighbor on his southern border in Egypt. However, Amalric subsequently committed a fatal error that ultimately thwarted his ambitions of attaining control over Egypt and the overall success of the Crusades. Rather than maintaining his support for Fatimid Egypt during its period of weakness, he elected to invade the country in 1168. Amalric was compelled to retreat to Jerusalem after Shirkuh, in desperation, once more changed sides and besieged Nur ad-Din in Syria for assistance. This prompted Nur ad-Din to once more dispatch his great general, Shirkuh, to Egypt, where he encountered an enemy from both in front of and behind him. Subsequently, Shirkuh unopposedly advanced into Cairo, whereupon the Fatimid Caliph al-Adid, requiring his unreliable subordinate Shirkuh to be presented before him and demanding his execution, was substituted by Shirkuh as vizier, and Zengid Syrian de facto rule over Egypt commenced. After Shirkuh died in 1169, likely of a heart attack, following the consumption of an exceptionally large and lavish meal, Saladin was selected to succeed him as the political governor of the country, despite the fact that Saladin was a Sunni and the Fatimids were Shia. The appointment of Saladin as vizier of Egypt has been the subject of considerable historical debate. Some historians contend that al-Adid, the Fatimid caliph, selected Saladin in the erroneous belief that he was an easily influenced, naive, and complacent statesman. Saladin, who had recently been appointed vizier, found himself in a precarious situation. In addition to being a Sunni residing in a Shia-dominated region, He was also a foreign occupier with strained allegiances between Caliph al-Adid, his master in Cairo, and Nur ad-Din, his master in Syria. As a result, his rule was met with widespread skepticism and opposition. Nevertheless, Saladin established himself as an exceptionally effective ruler of Egypt, initiating a governance reform and thwarting an assassination plot hatched by a group of soldiers and emirs. His chief intelligence officer uncovered the plot, and as a result, he executed the chief conspirator, the civilian controller of the Fatimid palace, Naji Mu'taman al-Khalifa. Moreover, he solidified his reputation as a proficient military commander by stifling a rebellion comprising 50,000 black African soldiers and their accomplices, who opposed Saladin's newly implemented Sunni practices within the Fatimid regime. Following this triumphant resistance against rebellion, Saladin initiated the process of consolidating his authority in Egypt. In doing so, he appointed members of his own family to prominent positions in the region and endeavored to impose reforms on the Fatimid dynasty. Furthermore, he promoted the dissemination of Sunni Islam and progressively acquired and maintained greater control over state affairs during his reign in Egypt. This was partially accomplished by him by establishing Shafi colleges, which were devoted to the interpretation and practice of his own Sunni legal denomination, and colleges for the Maliki branch of Sunni Islam. He also established legal doctrine in Cairo and other regions of Egypt in accordance with Sunni principles. Saladin's reputation and power were further enhanced when he crushed a major Crusader Byzantine naval force at the siege of Damietta in 1169. With the assistance of reinforcements from Nur ad-Din, his forces successfully thwarted an attempt by their Christian adversaries to invade Egypt. This resulted from the Crusader states being surrounded by hostile Muslim powers, which further solidified Saladin's position and that of Egypt as a whole. Amalric, realizing that the unification of Syria and Egypt, which had previously been adversaries, could potentially spell doom for the Crusader states, assembled a massive naval force with the assistance of the Byzantines to invade Egypt. Nevertheless, Amalric's army was largely thwarted on the way to Egypt, and Saladin defeated the invasion force with the aid of reinforcements, fireships, and the weather. In 1170, Saladin launched an offensive against the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the epicenter of Crusader power in the Levant, after establishing a stronger foothold in Egypt. His forces besieged Darum, which is now known as Deir al-Balah, situated in modern-day Palestine. Saladin evaded the advances of King Amalric's forces and instead attacked and destroyed a portion of the city of Gaza, thereby sustaining military pressure on the Christian kingdom while preventing his army from ever engaging in a full-scale land battle. Subsequently, during the summer of 1171, the final Fatimid Shia caliph, al-Adid, became ill and passed away of natural causes. Saladin, sensing this opportune moment, seized power and reorganized Egypt under the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate, which was headquartered in Baghdad. This action effectively terminated the Shia Fatimid dynasty's dominion over Egypt. Consequently, the Fatimid dynasty came to an end, pavencing the Ayyubids, a lineage named after Saladin's father, Ayyub. Subsequently, on September 25, 1171, Saladin initiated a fresh campaign against the Crusaders, reuniting with his former commander, Nur ad-Din. Nur ad-Din launched the assault from his northern bases in Syria, enabling Saladin to advance from the southwest. Both Saladin and Nur ad-Din shared the objective of capturing Crusader castles and devised an assault strategy on the fortifications constructed by the Crusaders in Montreal and Karak, the former of which was quickly overthrown by Zengid forces. Nur ad-Din was compelled to attack this final position by himself, as Saladin was compelled to return to Egypt subsequent to receiving information that Crusaders were attempting to incite a domestic uprising against him at his own court, prior to launching his assault on the castle at Montreal. Subsequently, during the summer of 1173, Saladin's domain in Egypt came under southern assault by a Nubian army, comprising members of an ethnic coalition originating from present-day northern Sudan. Complementing the Armenian forces, the Nubians organized their forces in anticipation of a siege against the southern Egyptian metropolis of Aswan. Upon learning of the impending assault, the emir of the city beseeched Saladin for assistance and was provided with supplementary forces for the defense, which were led by Turan Shah, Saladin's brother. Upon learning of this reinforced army, the Nubians withdrew once more later that year, but were ultimately compelled to retreat once more. Soon weary of the Nubians, Saladin went on the offensive, advancing south to the Nubian city of Ibrim and capturing it as a show of force for the new administration in Egypt. Following his victory over the Nubians, Saladin sent 60,000 dinars, jewels, and an elephant to his former commander and teacher, the Zengid leader Nur ad-Din. During his journey to Nur ad-Din's palace in Damascus with these wealthiest items, Saladin attacked Crusader positions in the countryside, destroying agricultural produce and dwellings to cause economic devastation. While he abstained from targeting fortified castles, Saladin intended to expel the Muslim Bedouins, who served as guides and aides for the European Crusaders. Thus, he targeted the civilian populace of this Levantine region. Saladin was disheartened to learn on August 9, 1173, that his father, Ayyub, had perished in a horse-riding accident. Having benefited for many years from his father's astute counsel, Saladin was therefore adequately prepared to seize the numerous opportunities that would present themselves in the years to come. In 1174, Saladin, utilizing his authoritative status, issued a directive to his brother Turan Shah to launch an assault on Yemen. In doing so, Saladin effectively obtained the port of Aden, thereby establishing himself as a prominent political figure within the Fatimid Caliphate and augmenting their territorial holdings. Subsequently, in 1174, Saladin proclaimed himself Sultan of Egypt, thereby commencing the Ayyubid Sultanate or dynasty in the country. Subsequently, however, tensions escalated between Saladin and his former master, Nur ad-Din, who was deeply troubled by the ascent to power of his former subordinate. In an effort to seize control of the region, Nur devised a strategy to attack Saladin in Egypt. However, word of this plan reached Saladin in time for him to gather his forces outside of Cairo. Nur ad-Din passed away in Damascus on May 15, 1174, at the age of 56, prior to any conflict arising. His son, as-Saleh Ismail al-Malik, who was 11 years old at the time, succeeded him as ruler of Syria. However, due to as-Saleh's incompetence in effectively managing his territories, the Zengid dynasty's authority was further weakened. Internal strife among the Syrian emirs and nobles ensued, further undermining the nation. As a result, the threat to Saladin's nascent dynasty was diminished, and the Zengid Caliphate descended into crisis. In an effort to gain the young king's favor, Saladin initially attempted to do so by composing a heartfelt letter filled with sorrow over the demise of his father. In this letter, he vowed to continue serving and defending the Zengid regime and acted as a sword against his adversaries. After Nur ad-Din's demise, Saladin encountered a challenging predicament. He had initially planned to continue his campaign against the Crusaders, despite being aware that he would be in a better position to invade Crusader-held territory if he marched from Zengid territory in northern Syria, as opposed to Egypt. By exercising restraint and awaiting the request for assistance from the nascent king as-Saleh, he could have averted any potential conflict that might have arisen from his independent endeavor to obtain Syria, a region that had been under the control of his former master and was therefore prohibited by Islamic tenets. As-Saleh, the young king, was placed under the guardianship of Gumushtagan in August 1174. Gumushtagan, who had previously ruled as the emir of Mosul and was a close advisor to the former king Nur ad-Din, had assumed the effective role of regent of the Zengid kingdom. Utilizing his new position, he eliminated political rivals across Syria. This resulted in the exacerbation of pre-existing internal strife and added to the instability of the Zengid regime. Saladin, in response to a request for assistance from the emir of Damascus, who was threatened by Gumushtagan, dispatched 700 horsemen into Syria via Bosra, located in present-day southern Syria, after traversing al-Karak. Later, Saladin composed a memoir detailing the Bedouins, emirs, and soldiers from throughout the region who flocked to his army out of fear of Gumushtigan's influence. He arrived in Damascus on November 23 and rested the night before at the ancestral residence of his father. The following day, he marched to the gates of the citadel of Damascus and begged the defense commander, Rayhan, to grant him access. However, he was denied. Saladin issued the command for his brother, Tutakan ibn Ayyub, to besiege the citadel. 4 days later, the guard surrendered, granting access to Saladin and his forces through the castle's formidable arched gates. Upon establishing himself within the fortress, he was greeted with homage and congratulation from the city's inhabitantry, who acknowledged his power and influence. Saladin, after establishing Ayyubid rule in Damascus, relinquished control of the city to his brother Tutakan ibn Ayyub and proceeded to seize other regions that had previously been ruled by Nur ad-Din, but had since fallen under arbitrary rule following his demise. Hama was easily subdued by him, whereas he refrained from targeting the city of Homs on account of its formidable fortress, which he anticipated would be an extremely challenging citadel to breach. Subsequently, on December 30, he besieged Aleppo, where the infant king Saleh was seeking refuge. Recognizing the peril presented by Saladin, the king emerged from his palace to personally beseech the inhabitants and guards of Aleppo to resist submission to Saladin, an influential political figure who had earned the admiration of the communities he had thus far subdued. Saif al-Din, the Zengid emir of Mosul, subsequently dispatched an army to Aleppo to provide relief. At the Battle of the Horns of Hama, these forces encountered Saladin's forces. Gumushtigan, overcome with dread at Saladin's most recent aggressive moves, communicated with Rashid ad-Din Sanar, the leader of the assassins of Syria, and begged him to eliminate Saladin while he rested in his camp. The assassins were an order established in 1090 within the Ismaili doctrine of Shia Islam by Hassan I Sabah, a leader of the Nizari Ismaili Shia sect known as the Assassiyun. Their present leader, ad-Din Sanar, opposed Saladin because, contrary to the wishes of his sect, he had seized control of the Fatimid of Egypt under the authority of Caliph al-Adid. The Assassiyun implemented a strategy that revolved around clandestine and precise executions, which eventually came to be known as assassinations. Thus, on May 11, 1175, a group of 13 assassins infiltrated Saladin's camp. However, prior to executing their plan, they were apprehended by one of Saladin's officers, Nasir al-Din Kumatekan. One of the assassins was killed by another of Saladin's generals. The remaining assassins were compelled to flee. Immediately following this occurrence, Saladin obtained information that Raymond of Tripoli had amassed his forces in Nahr al-Kabir, a river that empties into the Mediterranean in present-day Lebanon. Strategically positioned for an assault, Saladin opted to advance his forces westward towards the city of Homs. However, he was compelled to retreat from Homs shortly thereafter upon learning that Saif al-Din, the cousin of Gumushtigan, had dispatched a relief force to fortify the city against assaults. During Saladin's military campaign in the western Levant, his adversaries in Syria and Jazeera initiated a propaganda war against him. These adversaries claimed that Saladin had abandoned any semblance of religious and moral integrity by fighting against his former master's land. In response, he disengaged near Homs and asserted that he was actually engaged in combat against the Crusaders, who had gathered in the west. The army of Saladin retreated to Hama, situated in the north, where it encountered a Crusader force that had landed. Upon learning of Saladin's advance, the Crusaders ordered a preemptive retreat, a maneuver that the Crusaders described as a victory opening the gates of men's hearts. Thus, Saladin restored his reputation with a bloodless assault on Hama and proceeded to assault Homs, ultimately capturing the city in March 1175, following a violent battle with the defenders stationed in the area. Saif al-Din, the leader of the Zengids and a regional power broker even surpassing Gumushtigan, became apprehensive upon learning of Saladin's success. Syria and Mesopotamia were considered his domain, So his ire was provoked when he discovered that Saladin had invaded his territory from his base in Egypt. Subsequently, Saif al-Din assembled a formidable army in Aleppo with the objective of expelling Saladin from his domain. The combined forces of Aleppo and Mosul, united in opposition to Saladin, advanced towards his northern stronghold of Hama. Upon realizing his overwhelming numerical disadvantage, Saladin attempted to negotiate a concession with the Zengids, pledging to cease all subsequent incursions north into Syria in the event of a satisfactory resolution. However, the agreement failed to materialize. Saladin, on the other hand, declined and made preparations for a confrontation, recognizing that no alternative was available to him. Consequently, he established a defensive stance on the Horns of Hama, a sequence of rugged and dusty hills situated in close proximity to the Orontes River. On April 13, 1175, the coalition forces of the Zengids arrived with the intention of attacking Saladin. However, they quickly discovered their position had been surrounded by Saladin's forces, and they were significantly weakened by his assault. The battle, referred to as the Battle of the Horns of Hama, commenced with Zengid forces successfully penetrating the left flank of Saladin's army. However, they were subsequently confronted by the elite troops comprising Saladin's personal guard. Saladin was subsequently bolstered by a substantial contingent of reinforcements that had arrived from his base in Egypt. Although the battle was relatively bloodless, it yielded a substantial triumph for Saladin, who relentlessly pursued his adversaries throughout the region. Subsequently, the young king, al-Malik, was compelled to acknowledge Saladin as the sovereign of a number of strategic provinces, including Damascus, Homs, and Hama, in addition to several towns situated to the south of Aleppo. These towns had been captured by Saif al-Din's Zengid force during their pursuit northwards subsequent to the Battle of the Horns of Hama. Following this triumph, Saladin proclaimed himself king and suppressed the influence of al-Malik in prayers, popular culture, and coinage. In fact, he established his own coinage and ordered the development of prayers in his own style, as was his authority as king. Furthermore, the Abbasid Caliphate, which was based in Syria, acknowledged Saladin as one of their allies and shortly thereafter declared him formally esteemed as the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. The power struggle between Saladin's Ayyubid kingdom and the Zengids continued after the Battle of the Horns of Hama. Ultimately, this dispute was resolved during their final confrontation in the spring of 1176, known as the Battle of Tel Sultan. Saif al-Din, Saladin's adversary, recruited his forces from regions such as Al-Jazira. Saladin advanced northward and crossed the Orontes River. Despite the fact that the sun was eclipsed during this initial advance, which was interpreted as a bad omen for the campaign, he continued northward and reached the outskirts of Aleppo, eventually arriving at a site situated just south of the city called the Sultan's Yard. Saif al-Din's forces and Saladin's forces engaged in fierce hand-to-hand combat at the Sultan's Mound. As the Zengids advanced, the left flank of Saladin's force was pushed back and crossed in front of their commander. As a result, Saladin was compelled to charge the Zengids' guard, which caused them to panic and lose forward momentum. Saif al-Din narrowly evaded capture as a result of this abrupt turn of events. However, many of his officers were captured. Upon discovering that their army had entered a hasty retreat, the Ayyubids amassed enormous quantities of booty from the Zengids, including jewels, horses, and armor, which were not retained but rather redistributed among the captured Zengid soldiers, who were subsequently set free. Saladin, having secured this victory, reportedly did not retain any of the spoils for himself. Having advanced to the north, he approached the gates of the city of Aleppo. Upon his arrival, he discovered that they remained closed, so he proceeded to assault neighboring cities, including Manbij and Azaz. A few days later, while Saladin was resting inside a tent owned by one of his captains, he was attacked by an assassin who stabbed him in the head with a knife. Fortunately, Saladin was still wearing his armor, which prevented the blade from penetrating. He then seized the assailant's hand and wrestled him to the ground, whereupon the assailant was promptly killed. The unsuccessful assault convinced Saladin that Saif al-Din and his associates in the Syrian assassins posed an eternal threat to his life. As a result, he resolved to strengthen his hold on Aleppo with the immediate objective of conquering the city. On June 21, the city of Azaz capitulated, leaving Saladin with an undivided army that he directed towards Aleppo. Once more, the city was besieged, but it resisted Saladin's ferocious assaults. After several days of negotiations, both parties reached a mutually agreeable resolution. Saif al-Din agreed to acknowledge Saladin as the ruler of the territories he had conquered. In exchange, Saladin promised that al-Din would retain control of Aleppo. This agreement held great importance as it granted Saladin regional recognition as the monarch of Syria. Following the conclusion of the treaty, al-Malik, the younger sister of the boy monarch, approached Saladin and begged him to return the town of Azaz to his rule. In response, Saladin graciously consented to the request. Saladin, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Zengids, and himself had successfully negotiated peace treaties by mid-1176. However, notwithstanding these alliances, the assassins, led by Rashid ad-Din Sanar, continued to pose a threat to his rule in Egypt and Syria. The assassins, situated in the An-Nusayriya mountain range west of the Syrian coastline and in control of 9 castles, maintained significant influence in the region. Their renowned combat prowess and capacity for precise executions contributed to the emergence of the term assassination, and the notion of the assassin as an occupation rather than a geopolitical association. With the objective of eradicating the assassins and their sway in the area, Saladin deployed his army into the Syrian coastal mountains in August 1176. However, he was compelled to retreat within the same month due to his inability to seize any of the fortifications under the control of the assassins. Instead, he was able to execute a scorched earth campaign against the region. The abrupt withdrawal has garnered considerable attention, with some contending that another attempt at Saladin's assassination ultimately precipitated the withdrawal. While this theory is highly contested, it is more probable that Saladin, having failed to conquer substantial territory, desired to refocus his efforts on opposing the Crusader forces. Saladin was cognizant of the potential for the assassins to serve as formidable allies to Christian forces in the area and desired to enlist them initially. Moreover, the Crusaders represented a shared adversary between Saladin and Rashid ad-Din Sanar, which laid the groundwork for an alliance between the two factions, which was subsequently exemplified by Sanar's deployment of forces to supplement Saladin's armies. After 2 years away, Saladin returned to Cairo in the late summer of 1177. The peace between the two forces was largely mediated by his uncle, the Emir of Hama, and the war with the assassins had been resolved. Upon his return, Saladin commenced the reconstruction of the city's fortifications and attended to several neglected state matters, including the construction of a substantial bridge at Giza, situated a few miles away. Amalric I, the former monarch of Jerusalem, passed away in 1174 from dysentery. As Baldwin IV, who was only 13 years old at the time, became king of Jerusalem, his uncle Raymond III of Tripoli ruled in his stead until Baldwin reached adulthood. Raymond and Baldwin entered into a peace treaty with Saladin the following year. Baldwin assumed the throne 2 years subsequent to his father's demise. However, his reign was anticipated to be brief due to his status as a leper. Leprosy was a bacterial infection that was transmitted through bodily fluids. Although the bacteria, specifically Mycobacterium leprae, initially exhibited no symptoms, they would ultimately cause the leper to endure inflammation of the nerve endings and body tissues, frequently culminating in sensory loss. Baldwin, the youthful monarch, remained resolute in his responsibility as king despite the infection. Throughout his reign, he endeavored to rule his kingdom to the best of his ability. In late 1177, for instance, the Kingdom of Jerusalem relocated a significant portion of its Christian forces to Haram, a fortress situated above Aleppo. This strategic maneuver aimed to besiege the fortress and consequently left Christian territory in southern Palestine with a limited number of defenders. Saladin, cognizant of the momentous occasion, marched to the city of Ascalon, which was presently situated in southern Israel. In doing so, he violated the peace treaty he had established with Raymond III of Tripoli, the uncle of Baldwin, and his 26,000-strong army dispersed throughout the environs, conducting raids and sackings of local settlements as far east as Jerusalem itself. Upon King Baldwin's assistance to Ascalon, Saladin granted him entry to the city with 375 knights. Believing that Baldwin had been contained, Saladin dispatched a portion of his force to hold the Crusaders at the city while he himself advanced towards Jerusalem. Nevertheless, Baldwin's small force, which included some exceptionally skilled generals, overcame Baldwin's containment and pursued Saladin before eventually reuniting with him. Due to their lack of readiness, the Crusaders swiftly overpowered the Muslim army. In desperation, Saladin fled the battlefield of Montgassard by means of a camel and set sail for Egypt. His forces were pursued for a distance of 12 miles following the battle. By December 8, Saladin had arrived in Cairo with a mere tenth of his army remaining. Despite this setback, Saladin persisted in conducting combat operations against the Crusaders in the months that followed. In retaliation for Baldwin's defeat at Baldwin's hands, Saladin defeated Baldwin in several other engagements during the spring of 1178. From his base in Homs, Saladin led skirmishes against the Crusaders, including one at Hama. As a result of capturing prisoners and spoils of war, he brought back numerous treasures and riches from each encounter. After Baldwin was defeated at Hama, Saladin issued the command to behead all captured Crusaders. Subsequently, he remained in Syria for the remainder of the year, refraining from any additional confrontations with his adversaries. In contrast, Saladin received intelligence the following year that the Crusaders were strategizing an offensive into Syria. In response, he directed Farrukh Shah, one of his generals, to advance to the Damascus frontier with 1,000 men in order to defend the territory against assault. Rather than engaging the enemy directly, Farrukh Shah's force was to illuminate fires to alert Damascene of the impending assault. Saladin would then proceed from the city. Baldwin and his band of knights attacked Muslim herders and civilians in the Golan Heights in April 1179, not anticipating resistance. Baldwin then advanced swiftly on Farrukh Shah and his forces, but did so in anticipation of the sheer number of Ayyubid troops that awaited him. Baldwin was subsequently defeated at Quneitra. Saladin, buoyant from this victory, requested reinforcements from Egypt, which delivered an additional 1,500 horsemen. Baldwin initiated the construction of an outpost along the road leading to Damascus, which extended northward from his location to the city, during the summer of 1179. With the intention of fortifying a passage along the road that traversed the Jordan River, colloquially referred to as Jacob's Ford, Saladin made a diplomatic offer of 100,000 gold pieces to Baldwin IV in exchange for his refusal to abandon the undertaking. Having failed in this endeavor, Saladin set his sights on demolishing the Crusaders' stronghold at Chastelet, a Templar fortress, situated at their castle. In anticipation of the impending assault, Saladin relocated his headquarters to the Banias Plain, extending through the Golan Heights, and situated there. This provided Saladin with an opportune moment to launch a counteroffensive. Led by his army, he charged the disorganized Crusader force, resulting in a decisive defeat and the destruction of the fortress. A considerable number of notable knights were captured throughout the battle, and a substantial amount of booty was amassed. Saladin then advanced and besieged the castle until its destruction on August 30, 1179. During the spring of 1180, Saladin embarked on a journey to Safad, a city situated in the Mediterranean region west of the Golan Heights. His objective was to initiate a comprehensive military campaign against the Kingdom of Jerusalem from there. However, Baldwin evidently expressed concern about this, as he conveyed a message to Saladin pleading with him to negotiate a peace agreement. The military prowess of Saladin was significantly compromised due to adverse harvests and droughts. Consequently, he acquiesced to Baldwin's entreaty to end hostilities. Raymond of Tripoli, on the other hand, vehemently opposed the truce and was incensed by the surrender of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Nevertheless, he was compelled to accept the stipulations of the accord when an Ayyubid raid targeted him and Saladin's navy approached from the port of Tartus, where Raymond was situated. Saladin capitalized on the truce in the Crusaders' conflict to strengthen his authority and made an effort to conquer Mosul from the remaining Zengids. Despite this, his endeavor was ultimately unsuccessful, and the Zengid dynasty retained dominion in the area until the Mongols conquered it in 1250. Nevertheless, Saladin succeeded in capturing Aleppo, thereby completing his dominion over Syria. Baldwin was crowned joint monarch of Jerusalem in 1183. He was the nephew of King Baldwin's sister Sibylla of Jerusalem, whose first husband William of Montferrat had died in 1177. Following this, in 1180, Sibylla entered into matrimony with Guy de Lusignan, an ambitious French knight who had captured her attention. Baldwin harbored profound apprehension regarding the future of the succession and attempted to annul their marriage out of mistrust for both his sister and de Lusignan. Despite his efforts to do so, they managed to remain together, and their subsequent ascent to power would result in catastrophic repercussions for both parties involved and the Kingdom of Jerusalem at large. King Baldwin ultimately succumbed to leprosy and passed away on March 16, 1185, at the age of 24. His nephew Baldwin V was crowned King of Jerusalem in his place. However, the kingdom was once again placed under the regency of the ever-present Raymond of Tripoli. The young king, who was ill and died just over a year after his predecessor, succeeded his mother Sibylla. Guy de Lusignan ascended to the throne upon the boy's demise. In the subsequent years, the Crusader armies and Saladin's forces engaged in combat, each anticipating the other's error. In 1187, Raynald of Châtillon, a knight loyal to Guy de Lusignan, embarked on a raid against a Muslim caravan notwithstanding the existence of a truce between the Crusaders and Saladin. According to some accounts, the raid resulted in the rape of the Sultan's sister, which prompted Saladin to vow to eliminate Châtillon. The Sultan subsequently dispatched his son, accompanied by a small army, on a reconnaissance mission in the vicinity of Acre. This son achieved a significant triumph at the Battle of Cresson. Subsequently, Saladin besieged the city of Tiberias, which incited the more sanguine members of Guy de Lusignan's entourage to advise the king against engaging Saladin in open combat. Raymond of Tripoli advised de Lusignan against engaging the Muslims, despite the fact that his own wife was ensnared in Tiberias. However, Guy disregarded this advice. Saladin, who had amassed an army of approximately 30,000 cavalry and soldiers, had also hoped that his incursions into the Crusaders' territory would provoke a response. Following a war council, the Crusaders did decide to abandon their supply base at La Safri and launch an assault on Saladin at Tiberias. Throughout their journey, the Crusaders encountered persistent harassment from Muslim archers. Additionally, Saladin's forces established a barrier between the Crusaders and the nearby water sources. As a result, within days, the army became despondent and starving to death from thirst, while Saladin's forces were supplied with water by recurring caravans from Lake Tiberias. Saladin amassed his forces in formation on July 4, 1187, while the Muslim army burned dry grass around the Crusaders to create a smokescreen. The subsequent engagement was not a battle, but rather a dismal failure and slaughter, as the Crusader army had become drenched in sweat, exhausted from the protracted hot march, and disheartened by the smoke, fire, and constant skirmishing. Rather than aligning themselves in a battle line and focusing on the Muslims, the Crusader army prioritized their pursuit of water at Lake Tiberias. This decision led to the army's complete disintegration as an organized force. Many members fled the battlefield as soon as they could, and the remaining members were compelled to either beg the Muslims for their lives or mount a rudimentary defense with the meager energy they still possessed. Subsequently, following a sequence of incursions thus, the Christians were doomed to an apocalyptic catastrophe at the Battle of Hattin, wherein only 3,000 nobles, knights, and troops survived. Those who did survive were compelled to abandon the corpses of their comrades, which were left to rot and fester in the sun, engulfed in maggots, flies that laid eggs, and birds that fed on carrion. Following the conflict, Saladin's tent was visited by Guy de Lusignan, Raynald of Castillon, and other esteemed nobles. The Sultan extended a drink to Guy, assuming that his refusal of the offer indicated that he would be spared. However, Guy transferred the beverage to Raynald, and Saladin subsequently withdrew the drink from Castillon, claiming that he had not extended it to him. The subsequent events are the subject of varying testimonies. Some contend that Saladin executed Raynald with a single stroke of his sword, while others suggest that he struck Raynald, signaling his guards to execute him immediately. Regardless of the veracity of these accounts, Raynald, along with every high-ranking noble in the Crusader army and the captured Knights Templar and Hospitaller, were all beheaded. Guy had anticipated the same fate, but the Sultan spared him, citing the proverb that kings do not kill kings. He was subsequently captured as a prisoner in Damascus, but was spared execution by Saladin in 1187. As there remained no Crusader army capable of opposing the Sultan's forces, they captured each stronghold in succession. His objective was to seize Jerusalem without conflict, since a protracted struggle for the city would endanger the lives of Muslims residing within its walls and potentially result in its destruction. Despite this, the defenders, commanded by Queen Sibylla and Balian of Ibelin, were cognizant of the fact that if the city were to be captured by force, they would be executed or enslaved. In due course, an agreement was reached whereby the inhabitants of Jerusalem would vacate the city unscathed in exchange for a nominal ransom per head to be paid to the Sultan. However, the funds collected were insufficient to secure the liberation of more than 18,000 out of the city's 30,000 inhabitants. The remainder were enslaved. A select few managed to reach the coastal city of Tyre, the final bastion of Christian resistance in the Holy Land. The fall of Jerusalem evoked a profound sense of following in the footsteps of Adolf Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who amassed an army and advanced through Anatolia towards the Holy Land, perished when his horse slipped while traversing a river. The Crown Prince of England, Richard I, subsequently endeavored to amass his own army by affixing the crucifix and embarking on the Crusades. Thus, he joined King Philip II of France. Meanwhile, Guy de Lusignan, who had been liberated by subsequently, in June 1191, an army under the command of Richard I, totaling 17,000 men, arrived in Acre, bolstering the Crusader forces and solidifying their control over the city. Richard had transported prefabricated siege engines along with him, which were presently erected against the city's walls. However, Saladin responded to this by employing Greek fire, an ancient flamethrower that he ignited and reduced to ashes. Richard subsequently presented gold to his men in exchange for each stone they managed to extract from the foundation of one of the city's towers. Subsequently, the tower collapsed, allowing the Crusaders to storm through the aperture and ultimately seize the city in July 1191. In the process, they captured nearly 3,000 prisoners and captured the city. Richard endeavored to negotiate the release of the prisoners in return for monetary compensation and the return of the True Cross, which the Muslims had seized during the Battle of Hattin. Saladin initiated preparations to secure the return of the True Cross, which had been seized by the Muslims during the Battle of Hattin. Richard, cognizant of the fact that he could not conquer Jerusalem without seizing the southern port of Jaffa, departed in August 1191 with his army along the coast in order to be easily supplied by the sea. Additionally, Richard commanded his troops to pause during the heat of the day and rested at water sources, as they were dependent on consistent water supplies. Saladin diligently observed the Crusaders, persistently besieging their rear guard, until he attacked Richard's army on December 7, 1191. The Muslim forces surrounded the Crusaders and started showering them with arrows, hoping to elicit a charge in response. Richard, cognizant of Saladin's strategy, issued unequivocal directives to his troops to maintain formation. However, the Knights Hospitaller betrayed his orders and charged the Muslim forces. Richard, having achieved yet another renowned triumph over Saladin at the Battle of Arsif, occupied Jaffa and reconstructed the city's defenses before advancing towards Jerusalem. Despite this, they were unable to capture the city due to a dispute among army leaders regarding whether they should attack Egypt and coerce Saladin to surrender Jerusalem, or take the city by force directly. This, in conjunction with the expansion of the Crusaders' supply lines, ultimately hindered their progress. Subsequently, Saladin launched an assault on Jaffa itself, but was once more defeated by the Crusaders. This forced both sides to recognize that they were incapable of achieving a decisive victory over the other, and peace negotiations commenced. The Treaty of Jaffa, which stipulated a 3-year ceasefire and permitted unarmed pilgrims, including Christians, to visit Jerusalem. Richard subsequently withdrew from the Holy Land in October 1192 and returned to his homeland, bringing an end to the Third Crusade. Despite this setback, Richard did not secure a decisive victory, as Saladin retained the majority of his victories over the Christians and, more significantly, held Jerusalem. However, the Sultan's prognosis did not improve any further. Saladin contracted a fever less than 6 months after Richard's departure and passed away in Damascus on March 4, 1193. It was not possible to pay for his funeral because he had donated the majority of his wealth to his subjects in poverty. However, he was ultimately interred in a mausoleum in Damascus, within the Umayyad Mosque, which bears his dynasty's name. Saladin's tomb remains in Damascus at this time. In a matter of decades, Saladin rose from complete obscurity to become the preeminent leader in the Muslim world and, arguably, the most powerful man in the world, until the ascension of Genghis Khan. It is also reasonable to assume that had it not been for the unification of Egypt and Syria, it is improbable that a regional power of sufficient strength to repel the Mongol invasion in the subsequent decades would have emerged. The Saladin's eagle, Saladin's personal emblem, remains emblazoned on the Egyptian national flag and is also featured in the coats of arms of Iraq, Somaliland, and Yemen, indicating the enduring significance of his influence in the political culture of the Middle East. Despite the fact that both sides committed atrocities and massacres during the Crusades, Saladin was not necessarily the saintly figure that is sometimes portrayed him to be. Nevertheless, his brilliance as a military commander and leader, as well as his effectiveness as a ruler, cannot be denied. Possibly more so than anyone else, he was accountable for the Crusaders' defeat. Presently, he is regarded as a colossus of the medieval Middle East. What is your assessment of Saladin? Did he merely experience good fortune in recapturing Jerusalem by exploiting the weaknesses of the Crusader states? Alternatively, was he among the preeminent leaders of the Islamic world, credited with uniting Islam against the Christian invaders and reclaiming the holy city for the Prophet's children? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.